The final film we will be talking about this week is Steven Soderbergh's Presence, a unique and fresh take on a ghost story, a haunted house story, some might say as well, starring Lucy Liu and a few others I've never heard of. This film was very interesting. I have a lot to say about it, but I'm going to keep stum because my producer and my fellow co-host doesn't really know what my opinion of this film is. So I'm just going to pass it off to you, Reuben. Please tell me, this is a really interesting cinematic experience because it approaches things from a slightly different way, and I'd love to know your opinion of the film.
So, this is the new film from Steven Soderbergh, and it tells the story of a family. It's a bit like Flight Risk in that it is all set in one location. They move into this house, and in this house there is a presence which is felt most keenly by their teenage daughter. And the whole film is shot from the perspective of the presence. Is it a ghost? Is it a sort of, a soul left behind? We shall see. But the film basically exists in the form of a series of very, very long handheld takes. The film is really fluid. We're constantly moving with the characters as they go from room to room, location to location. And there is just this constant sense of them being watched as they go about their lives. And when you look at this on paper, in many ways, it looks like a kind of, a teen drama almost. It's about this teenage girl kind of struggling with adolescence, with her parents, with her brother who's kind of a big deal in their school because he's a really good swimmer. And she's also enduring grief because two of her friends have recently died from drug-related deaths. And what I think is so interesting about this film is that Steven Soderbergh takes this kind of family drama and he takes the ghost story and he melds them together through this kind of very, very unusual and I think quite brilliant movement of the camera, which embodies the viewer in this spiritual form in a similar way, I thought, to Nickel Boys, which did such a brilliant job of putting you corporeally inside the characters. And of course, this is doing the same thing, but kind of the opposite, because we are by definition not within a body. So it's a really, really interesting cinematic conceit, and it allows you to basically spy on these characters, but know that they are being spied upon, if that makes sense. In many ways, this film makes the case that every single movie is a ghost story because we are the presence in every film. The camera is the presence. Our gaze, the driving force of the story in many ways, is physically there. And I don't know if that's ever been done before. And that's what I love about Steven Soderbergh, because he is so committed to just doing really interesting things with cinema. I just love how interested he is in basically saying, you think you know what film is, you think you know what cinema is. Here's something new, here's something different. I'm going to do something crazy. I'm going to invent new storytelling techniques. And I thought it was, as a piece of, technical art, really, really fascinating. And I do think that it gives you a kind of emotional insight that you would otherwise not have. I didn't find it distancing in any way. I didn't find it that distracting. I don't think that this would work if it wasn't a ghost story, therefore, because so much of it hinges on the idea that you are a ghost and your presence is being felt by the characters. I'm not so sure about the characters themselves. We don't learn a huge amount about them. I thought there were some really, really good performances in that, and I think Lucy Liu gives the best moment in the film right at the end. I think she makes a sound which genuinely chilled me to my core. But what this film didn't do, I think its chief failing, is I didn't find it frightening. At no point was I scared. At no point was I necessarily particularly tense. And so, as brilliant as it is as a kind of cinematic experiment and as a puzzle box, I'm not sure that it works that well as a kind of ghost story on its own terms. But what did you think? I mean, am I being too harsh on it? I really liked it in the moment as I watched. And then in the days that have passed, my affection for it has waned slightly.
Now, it's very interesting, you say. I agree with a lot you said. Cinematically, it's a really interesting idea. And I think Godspeed to the cameramen and the steady cams that they used for this. It was very well achieved. They used a lot of very wide angle lenses to sort of encapsulate as much of the scenery as they could. And I thought it had a slight warping effect that only the keen-eyed and people who are looking for it would find it. So I didn't find it distracting at all. I found that it was actually quite a beautiful to see a film in this quite intense sort of shot composition. And I loved the quietness of it. I thought, again, this film had a great first trailer, the idea of the presence. It was just going through the house. Really well done. I loved this film until a point. Or I was loving it. I was loving the vibe. I loved the idea. Oh my gosh, this is going to be a really interesting meditation on grief when the ghost can see the person who's grieving. It's almost like that age-old hypothetical. What if you could watch your own wake? You know, it's like, what do people think about you? What do people feel? And I was so excited to see a really interesting filmmaker take that concept, a brilliant concept. And I thought, great, it's going somewhere with this, and then it doesn't go anywhere with it. Doesn't go anywhere at all. It's sort of what this film for me fails drastically on is that it can't blend its two styles together. Is it a deep retrospective of grief and the idea of lingering souls, lingering presences, literally, or is it a ghost film? Is it a classic ghost film that has the ghost tearing up living rooms, tearing up spaces, causing disturbances, moving objects about? It has the psychic coming in and blessing the house or experiencing the presence. That is, in a word, I think all the aspects of this film that is ghostly is goofy. And that's a word that I really would use. That distracted me. When you've got this really gentle movement of a camera looking over these really broken people. Everyone in the house is broken. The brother is an asshole and really needs to work on himself, but is broken in that sense, doesn't really know what he's... Great line from the dad where he says, "There's a great man in you and I'd like to see him sometime."
I also love that. Yeah, I love that.
You know, the frustration of the mother who's sort of who favors a certain child, the frustration of the father who's dealing with not only trying to love both his children, but his kind of overbearing wife, and frustrations of moving house and the world-shattering frustration of grief. I found it quite an unpleasant watch by the end, and I'll get into it. I will spoil this film, so I will point out when I'm going to talk about spoilers, and then people listening to this or watching this can skip to a certain point that our producer can put in the edit. So sorry, Matthew, I have to deal with that. But so I found it a really missed opportunity because it works so well until you bring in this aspect that then corrupts the film for me. I find you're right, the characters are not very well explored because it's only fragments. The ghost isn't always there, it seems, to what we can see. We're not obviously watching 24 hours, 2 weeks in the life of this ghost, but we only see certain snippets that give us a bit of an insight into the lives of this family. There's a few more characters in this. The problem with this, there's a few twists in this film, but there's only a certain number of characters. So you're like, well, there's going to be one of these characters is going to turn out to be a bad guy. And this is where I get into spoilers. So the spoilers I'm talking about is a friend that the brother character brings home from school, fancies the sister, Chloe, who is the subject of the haunting, and they sort of start going together. They start seeing each other. This character is presented as being quite intense, but quite emotional, sort of resonating with Chloe's emotions that come from grief. This character then turns out, in the end, to be a date rapist and also the secret killer of the other two characters. And I was shocked in the cinema that they went this way. I was absolutely the only other character, not the one that's intense. So obviously, I thought, why even go that angle? Why even have them killed in the first place? It's far more interesting a ghost story if these characters did die of what they were expected to die of, drug overdoses. It's a meditation on the epidemic of drug use in underage people. But no, it turns the way that this jokerific performance, sort of completely out of place in a movie that's very subtle, very calm, you suddenly get this character trying to kill and attack the central female character, and then gives this long monologue, this villain monologue. It is a super villain's monologue delivered in a very intense performance. And this actor, I mean, there's places to go. This would work in a different movie, but it just feels really out of place and really sudden. We have ummings and ahhings of him being a person who drugs people and abuses them, uses them for his own nefarious needs. But this also brings me on to another major problem. I didn't like that aspect of it because I think it pushed it too far. It was it didn't fit in the idea of the film they made. It was like, we need the ghost to have a reason to have been here. We need their unfinished business. Another thing is the ghost, as a ghost, has inconsistent properties. So throughout the film, we've seen the ghost move objects, cause destruction, move stuff around, and then all of a sudden, once a character is in danger, the ghost can no longer do any of these activities. They can no longer cause harm. Whether they could cause harm to humans at all, we don't know, because there's not been an instant of them showing that, whether they can or can't cause harm to living beings. I don't see any reason why not, because they were able to destroy a whole bedroom. A couple of
I agree. I agree. And this bothered me as I was watching it in the cinema, because there is also a sort of strange effect at moments where it's like there is a kind of flexing of the screen and a kind of a muffled sound of someone trying to break through the screen. And you think, okay, yeah, so now the ghost is going to, directly engage. But it doesn't happen. And there's no explanation as to why the ghost is suddenly unable to do that. And that therefore calls into question the very end of the film. Does it follow its own rules? I'm not quite sure. I'm not sure, to me, that matters that much. You said the word goofy, and I think that is right. I think it is, at the end of the day, quite a silly film. But it is wearing a serious film's clothing.
I absolutely agree, and I know I've been waffling on. I think whenever I get so into a film, and that's a good thing. I was so connected to it because I loved the concept, I loved the presentation. I just thought that because they were using these tropes of a classic ghost movie, the psychics, the moving of objects, the presence itself, people being able to feel something, but only certain characters, not all of them, the dismissive, it had all those tropes, but was also connected to, it was a bit like the Wolfman or the Invisible Man. It was an approach to a different kind of classic monster movie. But I thought that when it actually lent to the tropes, you need to understand what is the reality of where do the parameters of your supernatural being live, because when it does have aberrations that don't make sense, because it is supernatural, our suspension of disbelief drops. And I think that really separated me from the movie. That was the sudden point where I'm like, oh my gosh. And then tailored with this serial killer narrative as well, that is kind of labored and sort of put in at the very much at the very end. It would have been more interesting if the character had just been trying to engage with her non-consensually, which of course is a nasty and very severe topic to talk about, but it felt very jarring that he was also the killer of the other two characters. And then you have this fact that the ghost no longer works. It's having performance anxieties. It just doesn't succeed. And then it results in another aftermath that just leads to more grief and more suffering and all this. I was very disappointed. And I think that was the problem with this, because I was so looking forward to seeing this one. And I was very disappointed. And I find that, he's a great filmmaker, and I don't want to judge it because it is well made. I just find that maybe some of the story is a little rushed and is a little out of place. But, I can respect people going to watch it to just experience the feeling of being the ghost and love. And as much, the problem is it would just be stealing now. I'd love someone to try and take that a different way, to sort of have a bit more of a, either go the full hog and go a proper ghost film where it does complete ghost things, but we're from its perspective, like the movie In a Violent Nature, which is a serial killer film from the serial killer's perspective, or it goes the opposite way, where it's a ghost that has to deal with almost like Casper the Friendly Ghost, has to deal with people's emotions, but how it deals with it and how it engages in a way to allow people to recover from their trauma. And I think that would have been an interesting way to take it, and the way I thought it was going to take it from the beginning of the film. But anyway, I'd still recommend it, but I don't think people will be as fully immersed as I think the film wants them to be. You're right, it's wearing a slightly more serious film's clothing, but we see right through it like a ghost.
I think that it is an interesting film to watch alongside The Brutalist, because these are two very, very different kinds of film, not just in terms of their genre, but in terms of their whole approach. You've got The Brutalist, which is, shot on 35mm VistaVision. You've got this, which is shot on, I think, fairly cheap prosumer cameras. It's all immersive, it's all digital, it's super wide angle lenses. It's a drastically different approach to filmmaking. But I actually think they're a kind of brilliant dual release, because on one screen, you can see a really, really experimental historical 3-hour epic that is pushing boundaries, but in many ways kind of reinventing the idea of kind of, traditional cinema making. And then on the other screen, you have something that, to be honest, is barely, recognize each other, I think, because they're so radically different. You've got an 84-minute, completely digital, very long take, almost sort of found footagey ghost film that's speaking a completely different language. And I just think that in many ways they're a great double bill. If you had time, I think it would be really interesting to watch them on the same day and go, wow, isn't it brilliant that cinema has that much variety? And that's completely wonderful. I really, really do recommend that people seek that out. I know I'm a little warmer on it than you, but I think it's really worth watching. I thought it's good fun. It feels at times really kind of atmospheric. It has a fantastic score. I have to say, I love the soundtrack. And, you know, at the end of the day, it's something completely new and completely fresh. And normally that happens very rarely, but this week it's happened twice.